Thank you, Trissa, for that wonderful prayer. I think I'll speak in English today. And we're starting a new series. For those that don't know me, that's the only language. We're starting a new series, the book of Esther, and we're focusing in on Esther as a person in particular. So if you've got a Bible or Bible app, flick on over to that book. Some of the key verses I will put up on screen, so we'll be able to read some of the verses from the screen as well. Esther, for such a time as this. Today we're going to look at Esther's world. And the message today will be based on chapter 1 of Esther. But I just want, as an introduction, just to think of Esther, the person, right at this moment. What could be more challenging to this Jewish girl than to be an orphan many hundreds of kilometers away from her homeland, struggling to survive, even to comprehend her own identity, simply trying to exist in a totally foreign land, a pagan land, the land of Persia. Now, her parents were originally captives and exiles from Israel, and they had since passed away. And now she's so vulnerable, so alone. I wonder, did she ever at all consider giving up, dying? Or perhaps she was tempted to blend in and look like a pagan Persian in the land that she was living in and worship their idols. No, I don't think so. But with the help of Uncle Mordecai, and more important, the overriding hand of God, she ended up, Esther, becoming a lifesaver for the entire Jewish race. So first we come to chapter 1 of the book of Esther, and it describes Esther's world before even Esther herself is introduced into the story. And what a strange world it was. It was a world of total idolatry, of obsessively proud rulers, of pagan unbelief and practices that were horrific to the Jew, of self-centered worship, of a world that seemed that Yahweh, the God of Israel, just seemed to be almost, dare I say it, missing in action. Where was God in all of this? And while this is all happening in Persia, back in Israel, in Jerusalem, a different story was taking place. The temple was being rebuilt under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and the people were slowly rediscovering their identity as the people of God once again. But that seems such a world away to the Jews who were still in Persia, in this foreign land, and to Esther in particular. And they were under, in this foreign land, incredible pressure, I imagine, to conform with the surroundings around them, to conform with the environment that they were in. And I think it's not unlike, and get this folks, the increasing pressure you and I are facing in New Zealand today. To conform with the worldviews, the attitudes, the statements, the beliefs of people around us. You know what I'm talking about today, whether it's at work or at home or at school, at uni, wherever you may be, there's this pressure to conform. Well, one of the inspiring, challenging things of the series that we're going to go into is that Esther faced all of this and more. This young lady, and yet she had the courage and the faith to step up and stand out against that conforming pressure that she was in. And the challenge will be, as we go through the series, is for us, friends, are we prepared to take courageous steps of faith in following God? This is Esther's world that we're going to look at today. So let's read verse 1, chapter 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush, which is northern Africa. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media. The princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For the full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. We're starting to see already in chapter 1 that Xerxes, the king of Persia, was a powerful and, we will discover, dangerous king. Who was this Xerxes? Some of your English Bibles will have his Hebrew name, Ahasuerus. And he took over the Persian throne from his father Darius. And it was under Darius's rule that the Jews began to rebuild the temple once again in Jerusalem. And so it's generally accepted that the story of Esther takes place between the time of the completion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the return of the exiles under Ezra. And you can read further background about that from Ezra, chapters 1 to 7, if you want to look more into the background to our world of Esther that I'm speaking about today. The book of Ezra, chapters 1 to 7. Well, Xerxes is the king of the moment. He's the one that Esther is going to connect with. Later on, Xerxes was assassinated, and then his son, Artaxerxes, took over the throne. And as we go through our series, Esther will become the queen of Xerxes, and her story takes place in the city of Susa. Now, if you can't read the small print on that, aim for the direct middle of the map, and there is Susa, one of the capital cities, one of the main cities of the Persian Empire. And this is where our story and our series takes place. Xerxes was the winter residence of the kings of Persia. And Esther and her life and our series will take place right there in the city of Susa. I find it really interesting that we're focusing on Susa, in the middle of Persia, the Persian kingdom. All the while in Jerusalem, there's the work of God slowly taking place in the building of the temple. And we see that God is interested in his people no matter where they are located in the world. I find that a comforting thought even for us today. Wherever we may be from, God is interested. He is involved in our lives. And so the king, we read in verse 3, decided to have a huge banquet, a huge time of celebration together based at the citadel of Susa. The citadel was his fortified palace. And the details we read in chapter 1 describe the extravagant nature of what he did. And in fact, the details described tie in very much with world history. The Greek historians believed that at this time, Xerxes was planning a military campaign, and he wanted to impress his kingdom, and he brought in all the key people, the leaders and officials, to Susa at this time for the 6-month party. Anyone had a 6-month party? Would survive. For 6 months, a celebration. He was showing off all his power and his splendor. But there was a reason behind it as we read world history events. There was a reason behind it. He was bringing all of his nobles, his officials, his military leaders, princes and governors. He brought them all together to rally support for his military campaigns against the Greeks. So Xerxes wanted to display his wealth, to show that he could make good on his promise, that he would reward everyone who supported him and rallied to him in terms of his military campaign. So there was reasons behind this tremendous display of wealth, this party, this celebration for 6 months, for 180 days. And if you look at the text of verse 4, it's described as this: he showed forth for that whole period of time his vast wealth. Notice the words, and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. Woo! Exalted words, aren't they? Are they not the kind of words we would use and have used in our worship this morning? But Xerxes was doing it, showing off his splendor, his glory for this long period of time. And then after the 180 days of celebration, he concluded it, climaxed it with a 7-day banquet in which there was unlimited food and drink. And we read in chapter 1 this detailed description of the banquet that took place in his palace in Susa. It took place in his gardens. And it's amazing the detail, you look at it later, the detail of his description of the gardens that he had this banquet in. Again, it emphasizes his wealth and therefore his power. You see, the king was expecting men of his empire soon to march in battle at his command. So he wanted to be impressive. He wanted to show them how powerful and mighty he was. And so the first section of Esther chapter 1, verses 1 to 8, is the section that paints an elaborate scene of extravagance. And the intended purpose is Xerxes is displaying his wealth and splendor and glory as the one who was the ruler of the world. Imagine some Anita, some background music, some exalting music. The ruler of the world. This is Xerxes right at this time. But a spoiler. Something's about to happen that'll ruin that. And it comes from his wife. They tend to know their husbands better than most. And her name was Vashti. Let's read what happened. Verses 9 to 12. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, here we go, Mehuman, Biztha, Habana, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the peoples and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. What's going on here? Queen Vashti defies Xerxes. By the way, just notice in that reading that Queen Vashti also had a banquet. This was for the women in the royal palace. So, why should the men have all the fun? So she had her time as well in the palace. But the king, after 6 months of celebrations and now a 7-day banquet, it tells us in the text he was in high spirits. Oh, I would have been worn out a long time ago. Yeah, but he was in high spirits and he made this demand. And he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring before him Queen Vashti in all her royal splendor. You see, he wished to display her beauty before all the princes, the nobles, the officials, and the military leaders. He wanted to show Vashti off as a trophy, as a living trophy of his power and his glory. Just as we read in verse 4, he had all his wealth, gardens, food, wine. He had everything. And then he wanted to cap it off with showing Vashti before the people. And perhaps his reason was to bring her before the people in her royal glory, to further inspire the people, the men, the officials who were there, to inspire their patriotism and loyalty to him. A little bit like the recent public appearances of Queen Elizabeth, obviously a lot older, but at her 70th Jubilee. And as you watched on and you saw on telly the amazing events that took place, how it sort of injected a whole lot of positivity amongst the people of Britain and the Commonwealth and the millions who watched in on television. It was a positive thing. There was sort of a sense of celebration in a world where there is a lot of negative news going on. And Xerxes wanted to positively influence his people for his own purposes. He had his own agenda, but Queen Vashti refused to come. And as a result of this, we read the king became furious and burned with anger. Again, just think, there's been 6 months of intense celebration and partying, really expensive as far as Xerxes was concerned, showing off his wealth and splendor because he wanted to impress the people, the nobles and military people in particular. He wanted to impress the men who were watching on and to encourage them, to convince them to obey his commands for when they go into battle against Greece. He wanted to put on a good show to convince them. And so now he says, bring Queen Vashti into my presence. And she refuses. I mean, what a letdown for the king. That explains the intense furiousness, the anger that he has at this time. How can he get all the people to obey his commands when his own wife wouldn't come into the room in his very presence? And so he was furious at this. And we start to see the true character of the king. He was drunk with power and ambition. And now he starts to make some foolish and cruel decisions. And this is really important for our start of our series because it's showing that the palace was not a safe place. And we need to remember this as we go through the book of Esther and focus on Esther herself. The palace was not a safe place. Incidentally, the ancient Greek historians, including Herodotus, give a different name for the wife of Xerxes. They call her a mistress. And they note how she influenced Xerxes early in his reign. And then there's a long period of silence. And then she comes again in the story, in the historical records, as one who influences, as Queen Mother, the son of Xerxes, Artaxerxes. And this is interesting because Artaxerxes was the son of Xerxes. He took over afterwards. And they worked out that he was about 18 years of age when he became king. And they worked out the timing that it was approximately around the time that Vashti was removed as queen in our story of chapter 1. And so Vashti and her mistress could be the same person. And that may explain why Vashti was reluctant to go before all of these men if she was pregnant. That could be one of the reasons, as well as the reason that she did not want to be put on show before a room full of drunk men. Whatever the reason, her action was a breach of protocol concerning Xerxes, and it placed him in an extremely embarrassing situation. And so we read on. This is his response in verse 15. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Verse 19, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repelled, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. So this was the reaction to the fact that Vashti would not go and obey the summons of King Xerxes. So King Xerxes, he got all his nobles and his wise men together as to what should we do with this horror of horrors. She didn't obey her husband at this time, and he consulted the wise men of the Persian kingdom. These were the second to most powerful people in the entire kingdom at that time, who had special access to the king. And these wise men, so called, advised the king that Vashti should lose her crown, as a warning to other women in the empire who might be tempted to follow her disobedience. And as you look at their response and their reaction to this, everything is blown out of proportion. They say in verses 16 to 18, she has done wrong against everyone. Everyone in the entire Persian kingdom, the most predominant kingdom in the world at that time. To that one response, these so-called wise men said, she has done wrong against everyone. She will set a bad precedent, a bad example. Women everywhere will despise their husbands. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Makes me wonder from a pastoral perspective. Perhaps the wise men were having marital issues themselves. They were feeling insecure. But then again, it's not surprising after 6 months of partying and celebration and all the extra things that went on during that time. And so a royal decree was issued. And a Persian royal decree can never be repelled. This whole thing will pop up again in our story through Esther. Whenever a royal decree was given, it could not be repelled, it could not be changed. Esther herself will face this later on in our story. Remember, it was the same for Daniel. That's why he ended up in the lion's den. Because Darius at that time gave a royal decree that could not be repelled. So Daniel had his time, an earlier time in history, in the lion's den. And so they made this and issued this decree that Vashti would never be able to enter the king's presence again. You see how the punishment corresponds to the crime. She didn't want to go into the king's presence. Well, from now on, she will never be able to go in to the king's presence. It's interesting, though, as I mentioned earlier about those Greek historians, Herodotus and co., how they said there was a long period of silence. And if a mistress was Vashti, that could well be the time when she was banished from the king's presence. And yet history tells us that she had influence on Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, later on in time. And so the word of the Persian king could not be repelled. It was because he was seen as divine, and his words would last forever, would stand forever. And so the men in their room had been drinking and feasting, came up with this idea about issuing this royal decree, and then they gave each other thumps on the back and high fives. Yeah, good thing, let's do this. Let's make this sort of decision that every man should be a ruler over his own household. Or this whole scene bears the marks of just drunken stupidity. And again acts as a warning to what's going to unfold in our story through Esther. This kind of behavior is going to happen again as we go through our story. And again, this is the kind of environment that Esther is entering into. It's dangerous, folks. It's scary. It's a terrifying environment for a young woman to go into, to be a part of. The danger of power. Xerxes thought he had all the power. He thought he had absolute power. But as we're seeing, people in power who are compelled by their own fears and anxieties all too often abuse the power with which they have been entrusted. Now, what a contrast to the one we've been worshipping this morning, to the King of Kings, to the Lord God Almighty. For we know there is only one King with perfect character who is worthy of absolute power. God, the eternal King, all-powerful, holy. And although he's not mentioned by name in the book of Esther, he is everywhere present. He's leading and protecting and encouraging those who belong to him, including an orphan girl who unknowingly is waiting behind the curtains, soon to be propelled to center stage. Her time is coming in our story. But today I just want to give you a glimpse of Esther's world. The author of the story has now set the scene. He has opened the curtains. The background drop portrays one of world kingdoms, of arrogant men who consider themselves gods. It's a terrifying scene, dominated by pagan kings, but before whom now comes a Jewish orphan captive by the name of Esther. The kingdoms of this world may appear daunting, impressive, terrifying, all kinds of descriptions as you think about the kingdoms of our world today. You name them. You name whatever empire, whatever nation, whatever government. And let's put them in a big pile. And let's add to this pile of the kingdoms and nations of this world all the previous nations and kingdoms of history. Let's make a big pile of all the kingdoms of the world. And then let's place over that the King of the universe, who sits high above all. He's on his throne. He's looking down at these kingdoms of men and power and all sorts of things that were going on. He looks down from his throne on high and he laughs at their impotence. He laughs at even the greatest of nations. In fact, all the nations combined. I want to read to you Psalm 2, because that's the sentiment of this psalm. The sovereign King over all looks down upon the plans and schemes of men and women. He laughs at their impunity. Psalm 2, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. And then the sovereign king, the God of the universe, refers to his son, the Messiah. We know who that is. And so now we have in this coronation psalm the reference to the Messiah. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. But blessed are those who take refuge in him. It's a psalm that depicts God's sovereignty on a global scale. And yet for many of us here today and watching on, we know God's sovereignty at an individual, personal scale as well. How God guides and cares for his own. And sometimes we may wonder, as those in Persia, the Jews in exile, where are you, God? Are you missing in action? But he's there. He is here. He's in your life. He's aware of what's going on in your lives, even when at times you feel he is so far away. He is there. Just like in the book of Esther, his name is not in print in the book of Esther, but evidence of his presence is stamped on every page. And so we'll see with the introduction of Esther next Sunday, you're going to have to come back, the introduction of Esther, the Jewish orphan, how God guides and cares for his own to accomplish his mighty purposes. He calls people for such a time as this. I want to finish with this thought, perhaps challenge. Have you ever considered that God has chosen you for such a time as this? And what we'll see through the series through Esther, God, what he did through Esther, he can easily do through you, through each one of us. If we, like Esther, are prepared to step out in faith, to trust in God, to be courageous, but to step out trusting in him and in his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. The one who is described in Revelation 19 verse 16 as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Amen.